so excited to welcome Fred Dust, who is the founder of Making Conversation, a designer, author, educator, consultant, trustee, and advisor in the sectors of business, in the social sector, and in basically every dimension of the world that we live in. Fred is known as one of the world's most original thinkers, applying the craft of optimism and human-centered design to our messy, messy world. Formerly, Fred was a global managing partner at IDEO. Today, Fred helps to unlock creative potential in business, the government, the educational sector, and in philanthropic organizations. And today we will be focusing on a flavor of futurism that is both practical and whimsical. I've had the opportunity to learn a little bit about some of this framework that Fred is working with. So very excited, Fred, to pass off to you and continue this conversation about the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. I know that it's hard because it's, or at least here, it's very beautiful outside. So it's like everything in you wants to kind of run outside. So I appreciate you kind of joining. And hi, Peter and other people I know. It's nice to see you. We should catch up at some point soon. Yeah, I'm actually excited to be here. I mean, to be honest, it's obviously like an honor to do anything with New Inc. It's like an institution that I care about quite a bit. So I'm delighted to actually kind of spend this time with you. And I think actually, it's sort of a critical moment to be in conversation around thinking about the future. And I'm going to give you a little brief anecdote around a conversation I had 2 nights ago at dinner. And I was sitting with a friend who literally we had a dinner planned about 17 months ago, and we canceled it because we were locked down. And since then, the restaurant that we were actually going to meet at has gone out of business. And we finally had dinner again 18 months later or 17 months later. And it was interesting. At one point, she said, what has this been? Has this been kind of a mirage? And does it just disappear in the background? And I just want to kind of start by kind of giving you the bad news that it wasn't a mirage. It's real. It happened. And I think in many ways, it's actually, we may be seeing further moments like this. A lot of the work I do in the world of public health suggests that we'll be seeing other pandemics. And so I think it's a mistake for us to kind of push back and sort of say, that was then, and now we're just diving forward 100% into the now. And the other thing that I kind of want to pull out, and I think it's kind of the goal of the work that we're going to do today, or the conversation I want to have, is that we have a role to play in the future that we sort of establish. And it's really interesting. I'm working with an organization that's made up of journalists, and I spent the morning with them. I was telling Kelsa, it was very funny. Like, I had a 9 a.m. meeting, and I was like, how do I dress up for a meeting in an office? We all got to the meeting room, and it was clear that like none of us remembered what it felt like to actually sit around a meeting table. None of us, like, it's like there were tools in the room that were like, oh yeah, that's a whiteboard. What do we do with that? It was a fascinating thing to kind of be like untethered from all the things that we understood to be like the normal way of meeting and connecting. But one of the things that was really interesting, and as we were in conversation, was people sort of talking about the future as though it were something that was going to happen to them, that basically they had no control over. And one of the things I want to talk about today is we absolutely have control over the futures that we want to have. And one of the things we want to do is kind of make conversation so that we can actually get to the place where we're actually kind of constructing the future that we want to have. So that's really kind of the theme of what we're going to be talking about today. What I thought I was going to do is, like, from the opening is kind of, before we get into the kind of like the real methodology, which we're going to kind of get to, which is called hunch hour. And Kelsa said, and it's appropriately true, that it makes her a little hungry to talk about it. But I thought it might be worthwhile for Karen and Kelsa and anyone else, actually, frankly, because it's one of, to kind of just have a conversation about some of the things that we're thinking about, or kind of things that are on our mind about a conversation. But that the future makes everyone hungry. It's like that is, believe me, that is the future. So I thought maybe before we did that, I would give a little brief summary of kind of the journey of kind of working on the book and what's been happening, and then just open it up. So as Kelsa said, I was a global managing partner at IDEO. Right around 2016, all of my clients lived in the philanthropic, large NGO and government space. And pretty much within a kind of matter of weeks, all that shifted and disappeared. Most NGOs at that point suddenly kind of focused on basic humanitarian civil rights in the US. The government had shifted entirely and didn't really care about the idea of kind of like design and thinking about human-centered design. And most importantly, the work I was doing, some of the work that mattered to me most, which was with the then Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who is now our Surgeon General again, was to work on his announcement of an epidemic of isolation and loneliness in America. And we were actually designing new forms of town halls that could allow for catalytic gatherings that connected people into communities, and also for us to learn about anxiety and isolation. And then the ways that it was kind of how it was kind of presenting itself in symptomatic issues for us as a society, everything from gun violence to opioid addiction, things like that. And then he got fired. And what we realized at that time is that both he and I had been working on book proposals. I've been writing a book proposal on why we lost conversation in America. His was on isolation and loneliness in America. And I took a little time off. I was a little bit depressed and submitted my book proposal for auction, and the book sold. And it was basically on how to have the hardest conversations of your life. Well, it's actually not. It was like how we lost the ability to have conversations in the world. And the book sold. And if anyone's ever sold a book, what's really funny is that you get taken out to like a fancy lunch by the publisher, and they're like, "We love the book. We want to like you. Everything about the book is yours. We're not going to touch anything. It's all whatever." Which is what my editor said. And then she was like, "Except for the book that we bought, it was about like how we lost conversation in our lives. The book we need to write is about how we rediscover conversation in our lives." And I was like, "Well, that's a different book." And she was like, "I know, but that's the book we need." And so instead of it taking a year for me to write, it took me 2 years, because I basically had to find entirely optimistic examples of how people got through the hardest conversations of their life using creativity. And so that got a little bit difficult, but it also meant really amazing adventures. So I went on Camino de Santiago and walked the way to kind of get a sense of what it felt like to be in conversation if you're a pilgrim. I talked to a religious women's sex book club, like very religious women in Salt Lake City, but they had kind of created a sex positive book club and gradually kind of gotten to a place where when I met them, they were in conversation about Deep Throat because they had just watched the movie. And their first question for me was, "How do I get rid of the videotape?" And I was like, "I have no idea." Like, it's like, don't take it to the library is the one thing I would suggest. So it really became about discovering how people got through really hard conversations by being creative and thinking about that creatively. So that's a little bit how we got there. Tons of adventures along the way. I'm happy to share some insights and thoughts around that, but really would like to maybe open it, like to see if there's any kind of like thoughts, questions, discussion around like some of the questions or conversations that seem hardest today, or conversations that don't. So Karen or anyone else in the conversation, please.
Well, given that we just recently did the Onyx Showcase, which a number of New Ink members, alumni, and mentors were a part of or participated in, I was so fascinated what the artist Sarah Rothberg was doing, which was to have a conversation, a meeting in VR. And so what that meant was she was a participant or host. A second person whom she did not know was in another space nearby. And each participant went into VR and they were represented by an avatar on a screen. And as you had the conversation with each other, you were on these columns. And the more you spoke, the more the column rose until you got to an orb. And at that point was usually around 18 to 20 minutes. You would touch the orb together in VR, and that would be the conclusion of your meeting. But what was so fascinating, besides her putting these type of voice filters, which then, of course, you continued this kind of anonymity, was how you have conversations and what kind of conversations and what are you willing to say when that person doesn't know you, when you're represented by an avatar, when there's this component of whimsy and humor. And so, you know, it was really interesting. She didn't know what to expect. She said things were very organic. And in some cases, people told very revealing things. In other cases, it felt that people were very performative. And so it just goes to this notion about how you have a conversation. And if you don't have to reveal who you are your conversations more honest? So I just, well, what I thought I'd provoke you in terms of that's a very different way to have a conversation, and perhaps very much in the near future, we'll be having conversations in that manner.
It's so interesting. I want to hit on that because one of the people who inspired, and she's a friend of mine, and actually we've done some talks together recently, is who inspired me to write the book was Sherry Turkle, who wrote Reclaiming Conversation. And one of the things that Sherry kind of really argues is that it's the advent of new technologies that have kind of disabled our ability to have conversations. I love Sherry's work. I love everything about the way Sherry thinks. I disagree with that. Actually, I don't think technology is the thing that's actually been the kind of culmination or destruction of conversation. I have a very specific idea of what I believe is caused the breakdown in conversation, especially in the United States, and that, just is the headline, the media headline, and we'll talk about that in a moment or two. But what I love about that, Karen, is that one of the things that I was encountering as I was doing my research is people who were saying things like, gosh, I worry that my son's never going to fall in love if he doesn't kind of get used to having conversations on the phone. And that because somebody was had fallen in love with their partner by talking on late night phone conversations. Right now, I'm having a conversation. It's nothing as sophisticated as the AR VR example, but I'm doing a podcast that's actually an exchange of WhatsApp messages from an organization in Berlin. And every couple of days I get a kind of 2-minute kind of question or musing. And then I kind of every couple of days send back a musing, and they're going to be stitched together into a different conversation. And what I find, Karen, is I don't know this person at all. We have no relationship. I know the institution, but not her, is how strangely and immediately intimate it's gotten. Because it's that anonymity kind of plays into the ability to kind of reveal things.
Yeah.
Think about it. And I love this. I ended up studying a lot of religion as part of the book because religion has hosted a lot of hard conversations, also kind of provoked a lot of hard conversations. But the thing about the confession and the act of confession in Catholic Church, it's it could only happen in the dark if you don't see each other, right? That's the only way it can exist. So I'm so interested in these new kinds of mediums and the way they play out and what kinds of new conversations they allow us to have. Go on, please.
I mean, while we are on technology, and obviously it's been all the rage for the past 6-7 months, what's your take on something like the Clubhouse, which in many ways, many people have said it's transformative?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I've been on and off of it. I was kind of I was deep into it when it first started, and then kind of a little less so. But my issues, frankly, with Clubhouse have a little bit more to do with kind of the origins and the notion of kind of what sort of extractive qualities it's played in communities, specifically of color. I think that you know that a lot of Black investors came in saying we'd like to invest, and then they were kind of shut out. So it's been a really interesting kind of I think for me, a political crucible on that one. But I do love the notion of voice only. There is something really remarkable about that. And you think about what it felt like to kind of get applause in the old world, and then something like the notion that clicking on and off your microphone would be a kind of applause. There's something there. I'm just not down for Clubhouse necessarily. So it's and I've found myself kind of waning over time, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're here. What's the New Ink donut meetings, please? It's Janet, I'd love to know. Because I love a donut meeting, but I don't know if I know what it is.
So New Ink has It's a meetup with mentors or fellow New Inkers that you might not have met because of the current situation and our distance. And it's called Donut, and it's from what I'll have to hand this over to Kelsa to actually explain exactly what the algorithm is and how it selects who you meet with. But it's a somewhat randomized system where it puts two of you together, and you know that you have a short period of time, 30 minutes or less, to really connect. And every time I have done it, I think I have these organized questions, and I think I'm, formal in what I want or hope for from the person that I'm meeting with. And inevitably it becomes unexpectedly and sometimes like shockingly intimate so fast. And I think it's exactly what you were saying, that it's like that dark room of confession.
Yeah. What's interesting, Janet, is like that it's also another example, I think, of like kind of one of the things that I've recognized that makes a good conversation, especially when you're doing it in a public forum, is like an element of kind of suspense and surprise and excitement. And I had an experience, I had to design a series of meetings off the back of UN Global Assembly, which is like the big gathering of kind of world leaders. And it was a 5-hour Zoom on the back of UNGA. This was like last year. And we did that. We did kind of the equivalent of the donut. We would kind of do randomized kind of whatever. But what happens when you have like Madeleine Albright, in the room, and then you have like a Nigerian entrepreneur. I mean, so what was really interesting is like, that's quite literally like the kind of makeup of the room that I was kind of dropping, like 4 people. And it was like super senior people, somebody who's like on the ground doing work. And what I thought was interesting is that at this moment, the predominant question was, how can I help you? Like, it's like for each other. So basically, which was, I really thought was interesting. It's like, you're thrown in randomly, suddenly it's like, you're like wildly disparate kind of backgrounds. And the only way we could go forward was like, how do I help? Which, by the way, is if you go on a pilgrimage, and Peter, like you have a dear friend who you connect with, who actually basically is pilgrimaging all the time, as far as I can tell. But when you go on pilgrimage with somebody, and you're walking side by side with somebody on a long journey together into the future, what you find is that the only question that you want that's relevant is, how can I help? Like, or how can I encourage you? It's like this kind of real power about what happens when we realize we're all going in the same direction, I think. So it's interesting. Also, Karen, your reflection on technology is also interesting to me, because one of the things I think we've sort of seen is that the world has gotten a bit more permeable, right? So you can suddenly kind of get to people in ways that we never could get to anymore. And I would hate for us to lose that. I think that's been kind of a really interesting and powerful thing to have happen. I don't know if anyone's had any like unusual experiences where they've connected with people they never thought they could have. Certainly that was one of them. I text with Patrick Dempsey just because we started DMing, and I was just like, let's just move this to phone. So it's like every like Sunday night before he goes on set, like I actually like have to like talk him down from not wanting to go back to work. So that happened.
Well, I think what was so exciting for the New Ink community is people simply just had more time to connect. So I think for us, that was a silver lining, where mentors and folks who had been a lot harder to quote unquote get, all of a sudden were volunteering for office hours on a monthly basis, right? So, I do hope that some of that is not lost as we quickly scramble into the hecticness of life again. And I think, of course, a lot of folks have also talked a lot about how all of a sudden, during COVID, many of us spoke to our parents in a much more sustainable manner. Oftentimes I think we don't have enough time for family, and then all of a sudden COVID, everyone was learning how to do Zoom or FaceTime, and it was awesome that a whole generation of senior citizens are very adept now at FaceTime and Zoom because of wanting to see their kids and their grandkids. So I think that's another silver lining around, how to have a conversation, and that's with your family.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. And Karen, the reason I love the AR VR story and the kind of the prompt around technology is that one of the things that I really believe in is, and when we locked down and we were hosting all these large convenings, one of the things I had to do was write some principles for the way we thought about having conversations, like hard conversations, over Zoom. This was back in March of last year. And one of the things that I kind of talked about was letting the medium suit the message or the method, like, so it's like, so what's the right medium? So what's interesting about this WhatsApp conversation I'm having is that it actually acts more like letters. In fact, I did a lecture yesterday where I was kind of asking what people felt like the decline of conversation was. And one of the things that came forward was like somebody saying, I feel like we lost conversation when we lost the art of long letter writing, which I thought was a really interesting thing. Because it's like routinely, I always talk about like the moment that we invited television to the dinner table. Because I think that kind of eradicated a conversation for like a whole generation. But it's just interesting to find like where people find the where we lost it, I think, which is interesting. But maybe does anyone want to guess, like, I mean, I'd love to talk about like where I think we've lost conversation and kind of like, and get a sense. So maybe I'll talk a little about what I think, and I'd love to get people's thoughts. My feel, so in the book, I write about this thing called script spotting, and script spotting is when you kind of find maybe the unconscious scripts that are embedded in a space or in a conversation or in the rules of a conversation. So there's all kinds of rules that live around us all the time that tell us what kind of conversation we can have. So the easiest example is like, if I say board meeting, what do people see in their minds? Anyone want to offer? Board meeting.
I can offer.
Go for it, Elsa.
I see a long table with powerful people in suits.
That's right. And Janet, if I say, I'm not calling you for a specific because of any reason, but if I say a meeting, what do you see?
I see coffee cups and cigarettes, and meetings out on the sidewalk in front of where the true meeting is supposed to happen.
That's where all the dating happens. Is that those are great examples. What's really interesting is that what often what happens actually is that when we talk about a kind of conversation, we immediately kind of go to some mnemonics or like some memory that's often a visual memory. It's often a spatial memory. You know, it's like, oh, I see a long table. Oh, it's like I see cigarette smokers on the steps. Or very common also is like I see folding chairs in a basement. You know, is the other kind of like whatever. And so what that means is that our mind has established a script. We may have never experienced any of these situations, but we've seen it in movies and television or enough times that actually that's the way this script is set. And so what happens is you go into those spaces and then you start to act along that script. And so what I really want to do, what I think we need to be doing is breaking the things that set the scripts in our heads. And so I'm just curious, like, does anyone have any ideas of like, what's the dominant script setter in our lives right now? Peter or Karen? Yeah. Texting, that's one. What else? I'm curious. I'd like to get a couple ideas. Like, it's like, what sets the script for what conversations we have? Social media. One more. Peer influence. Politics. Yeah. So I actually, my personal belief is that it's the news hook, and that it's basically politicians and media that's actually setting the scripts for what we have. It's one of the reasons why like I often won't say words like divide, because I feel like those are words that actually are kind of fed to us by politics and media. I'm going to just say it myself. One of the worst moments of the last couple months was, if you love this article, I apologize, but New York Times did a piece on languishing. Did anyone read that article? It was basic. And so I had a friend come over to the house and she was like, I think I'm languishing. And I'm like, huh, so you've got like all these huge clients, you finally got a documentary film completed, you're dating, and like, what about your life is saying languishing to you? And that's a really great example for me of how the headlines set a script, is that by labeling something as languishing, you start to see languishing in your life. And not only that, if you were following up the New York Times, their movie reviewers were using the word. So they were like, oh, this movie is about Amy Adams languishing, or they'd be like, how not to languish. And so that's really kind of marketing an idea to you. It's not really news in a sense. And so I'm always careful around really precise language around things. Like one of the ones that I couldn't write about because we wanted to depoliticize the book was like the wall, right? Which has probably been the dominant metaphor in our lives over the last kind of 5 years. But we're not, when we talk about the wall, we're not talking about real issues, real things. And so one of the things that I really ask people to do is be really reflective if they're reading papers or news sources or social media in the morning, and don't get hooked by whatever the news is trying to tell you should be the script of your day. Because I think it was interesting. Somebody that during the pandemic, or during the whatever part of the pandemic, was saying like, you know, television was actually what kept a lot of people going who were isolated and alone. So it was a good way for people to kind of engage. I will say that if you wake up in the bedroom with the television on and you're watching the news, your day is set by whatever script is that they want to establish. And I don't want your script to be set by somebody else. I'd rather that we set it ourselves. Any other questions or thoughts before we kind of go into like a script that hopefully helps you set a kind of future bound vision? I'm curious. And any other questions or thoughts? It's funny, Peter and I got to actually meet a couple times and go for walks during the pandemic, which was actually, it was a nice way to actually kind of engage and get to know each other. If not, yeah, go Peter.
What's interesting when you're talking about turning on the TV, this is one of the struggles that I have. If you look at the majority of people identify themselves politically as independent, but the conversation is dominated by the extremes on both sides.
Yeah.
You know?
No, it's actually really interesting because it's like we were talking about. I was talking this with our congressman in Maine, which is that it's like we imagine that there's that we're this kind of polemic dialogue, but when you actually really look at the data, like it doesn't seem to be the case. But politicians benefit from kind of playing into the polemic, as does media, I think, in a lot of ways, which is something that I like really worry about in terms of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a you know, once we started to have media that permeated every part of our lives, it gets harder and harder to break through the script that gets set. So what I thought we might do is do a little kind of structured conversation about the future, if that's cool. And I'll do an explanation of what it is. So the methodology we're going to use is a thing. It's not a methodology. It's an idea we have is a thing called Hunch Hour. And the idea behind Hunch Hour is that it was built. Does anyone know Courtney Martin? She was a journalist and writer. She does a lot of work. She does a lot of fantastic work for TED and others. But she was doing work for the Op-Ed Project, and the work for the Op-Ed Project is basically to help people who wouldn't feel like their voices are valuable enough to do an op-ed. And what she wanted to do is get them comfortable in writing op-eds. And so I got to take one of these kind of classes with her, and it was fascinating because we came together, and what you do in a hunch hour, which we're going to do in a moment, is you throw out a hunch. You throw out something kind of like a hunch is like not a hypothesis or a thesis or something like that. It's actually something that's like lightly held. It's like something that you try in a light way. It's something that you came to in the shower or going for a walk. That's what a hunch is. And the way a hunch hour works is I throw out a hunch to the room, and I will in a moment. And if people kind of like think that hunch is right, they can confirm that hunch. So they can say, oh, I confirm that hunch, like I'm all down with it. Or if they feel like it might not be right, they say, I'm going to complicate that hunch. Like I'm going to say I don't agree. But the thing with confirm and complicate is that you have to give evidence. So you can't just say I disagree or I complicate that. You have to say I complicate it, and here's my evidence of why that doesn't work, or what I think is wrong. And evidence can be a white paper, something that you've read in the newspaper, a conversation you had with a neighbor or friend. There's a lot of reasons why we kind of look for the kind of broad spectrum of evidence around that. So I'm going to give you guys some prompts and have you guys do a hunch hour. And I was thinking that maybe we even do it as a full group, because I think we're small enough that we don't really need to break into groups. Kelsa, if you're fine with that, does that work? Cool.
Good with me, yeah.
So I'll start with like so just stop for a moment and think about whether you've had some hunches. I'm gonna sort of, what I'd like to kind of throw out is that maybe it's like, I would love you to kind of think about like a hunch about a new, something new that we're gonna see emerge in society. And I want you to kind of think about doing, that's good, like some cool new good trend that's in society. And I'm gonna also complicate it by being like, let's keep it relentlessly optimistic. You can't mention politics and you can't mention pandemic. So like we're like, that's like either in your hunch or in your evidence necessarily, if that's possible. So it's gonna make it a little hard, but I'll throw out a hunch I have. And then, and I'd love to see if somebody wants to complicate or confirm it. So I have a hunch that sandwiches are better if you cut them in half. Does anyone want to complicate or confirm that hunch?
Oh my God, we're back on the food.
So that's why it reminds you of food. It's like you were the one that kind of was like, oh yeah, and I'm like, maybe we'll use the sandwich hunch.
I would complicate that to say it depends on the type of bread and the context. Like what's like, are you walking and eating your sandwich? Are you seated in the stands at a game eating your sandwich? Or are you comfortable at a table with a plate?
Interesting, interesting. Okay, so that's a great complication. Can anyone confirm that sandwiches are cut or better if they're cut? Does anyone have a confirmation with some evidence? Anyone?
I do.
On this important lunch, I would appreciate your confirmation.
Is it possible to confirm and complicate?
Almost always. Yes.
Because I totally confirm that sandwiches as we know them here are better cut in half because all the juices kind of get squished first and then open. And then when you eat it, the sensation is much better. But if you eat a Spanish sandwich, a bocadillo, don't cut it in half. You have to eat the whole thing, especially if it's filled with fried squid or something like that. You definitely don't want to cut that. So I do think it depends on context and type of bread, as Kelsa said.
Ava, I think you're so right. And it's so funny because as I was saying this, because I'm like, I've never once done this where somebody hasn't been like, oh yeah, here's like all the evidence that it's better if it's cut. I was suddenly thinking like, oh, wait a second. I really love, I wasn't thinking about the bocadilla. I was actually thinking about like the French brioche sandwiches, like when it's like, you've got the like long, it's like the ham and cheese and it's just like this like really long thing. And I realized, wait a second, this is culturally biased. Like in France, like I don't want to cut my sandwich. Whereas like in England, I'm like, yeah, cut those things down to the smallest you can have. So I think that there's a lot that's based on the context. It's actually why like one of the other hunches, which is like people who eat burritos with knives and forks don't deserve burritos. What I've realized is that everyone deserves a burrito. So it's like I kind of like back off from that one. So those are examples of really good polished hunches. But what I'd love you to do is stretch yourself and try to think about whether there's like a hunch you might have on something kind of bigger that you think might be happening in society going forward. And I will say, I'll let you break the rule if you feel like there's actually evidence that's actually kind of based in some aspect of our return or not return to things. So what I'm gonna do is like, everybody just kind of like think for a moment, maybe like write down a hunch you have. Remember, a hunch is not something that you have that you take overly serious. It could be pickles, like pickles or whatever, or it could be something more serious. And then I'm going to ask somebody to share their hunch, and then I'm going to ask people to complicate and confirm. And because Ava was so brave to come on screen, she's gonna be who I'm gonna ask to share her hunch. So just so you know. Okay. So just a reminder of this, like a hunch. So whatever Ava says is like something she just kind of like thinks might be true, as you confirm and complicate, you have to do it with some form of evidence, and it can be personal. It can be. I mean, I think what was interesting about Ava's example is that it's like it was quite specific. Here's a certain kind of sandwich that you just ruin if you eat it that in that way. So I would love that. Actually, no. Hold on. Amy dropped one in the chat. So Amy, can you come on and give your hunch? Ava, you're like so saved, but I'll come back to you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Hi, Amy.
Hi. So I was kind of thinking about your rule that it ought to be optimistic. And so I feel some optimism and having a hunch that people are really turning against plastic, rejecting plastic bags, being, more reluctant to use, to drink, small bottles of water. That's my hunch.
That's okay. That's great. So Amy has a notion that we're turning against plastic. Would anyone like to complicate or confirm Amy's hunch? Peter?
I'm not sure I can complicate that. I tend
So
to
you-
agree with it.
You agree with it? Do you have any evidence?
My son, he went and got a Brita filter on his own after years of being yelled at for buying plastic bottles. And he just one day went and did it. And now he's completely changed, 21-year-old.
It's like, so that's, by the way, that's the perfect evidence. If you can say to your son, then it's like, that totally works. So anybody else, like, complicate or confirm?
I can complicate.
Okay.
I've traveled in parts of the Horn of Africa where the plastic bottle is necessary, ubiquitous. Trying to get access to water is tough, and it is the easiest and lightest way when you do get access to collect and then carry.
That's really interesting.
A way that I would complicate it was a year ago, many of the coffee shops and other places started to ban straws, plastic straws. And the community that I represented, the disabled, straws were their lifeline. And so that became a real issue of them being felt left out of a discussion or even being picked on or discriminated against.
Yeah, I'm going to complicate, and then I would love if somebody has a confirmation. I'm going to complicate, which is Washington Square Park. I don't know if anyone's walked through Washington Square Park on a morning recently, but it's like, especially with the kind of the takeaway cocktails, which I guess just ended like in 2 days, I guess. There's only, it's like it can be kind of like it's all plastic, which is sort of interesting. Anyone want to confirm? Is there anyone that has a confirming hunch? I can confirm, which is that I do think that back during the pandemic, a lot, or like during the kind of heart of the pandemic, we moved to a lot of kind of like sort of stable storage for our food. So we like, I think actually a lot of us have now glass and ceramic. It was just like, it was getting marketed like crazy. And so I think that there might be some lasting changes from just kind of the ways we've actually been storing our food recently, just because we might not be shopping as much or things like that. Whether that lasts is a whole other thing. So that's it. Amy, thank you for that. That was a great one, because it's like, I was going to go like straight up, like, I agree. And then what I think we got is in a place where it's like, there's a bit of tension there, and that's a good thing. So it's like, what we have to say is like, oh yeah, to kind of build us forward into kind of a more kind of full hypothesis, we might have to do a bit more research around that and kind of get someplace really, really kind of solid on that. But it was just the perfect example, because it's one of those things where it's like everything in you says, I want to agree with this and I want to do it. And then like, you're like, oh, wait a second, but there's kind of pros and cons around it. All right. Who is up for another hunch? Anyone have a hunch? And I think we lost Ava, which is like totally cheating, but it's like, hi. Hi, Peter. How you doing? It's good seeing you. And not on the Instagram. It's Janet, Karen, Ava, anyone have a hunch? Lightly held, not about sandwiches.
I have a hunch that that space travel will be possible for citizen scientists and will be supported by private sector rather than government agencies.
Oh, that's a really sophisticated hunch. So I just like that's that. So does anyone want to complicate or confirm that hunch? Anyone have a complication or confirmation or complication?
I mean,
Sure. As far as I understand, the human body can't sustain itself for a long time outside of gravity. So that is a complication that we can't avoid.
So you're sort of saying that because it could be bad for our human health that we may not kind of do that.
Yeah. Apparently, long duration in space, our bodies kind of fall apart.
Interesting. And Janet, were you thinking about these as kind of short excursions or long durations, just so I can get a sense?
I was actually thinking of shorter excursions, but I actually agree with Jonah on the long duration problems.
Yeah, let's try to not go long term. Let's not go to Mars with citizen scientists. I feel like that would be a little cruel. Anyone else want to confirm Janet's hunch? Short excursions for citizen scientists supported by private sector.
I'm going to agree and complicate it. I do definitely think private sector is all over space travel, but it's not for the citizen scientists. It's for the rich white man who can afford it. So I'm thinking Elon, I'm thinking Bezos. Who else is Branson's been on this kick for actually a couple of decades. So yes, it's definitely going to happen, but who gets to actually be the first folks to get to do it? I think we'll work around money and privilege.
Interesting. So can I complicate that? Because I agree with you, Karen. So I'm gonna complicate your complication, which will be a confirmation for Janet, which is that I actually I 100% agree with you that it's going to be led through the private sector and it's going to mostly benefit rich white men who want to go to space. However, I think the thing that complicates it is marketing. So I feel like that at some point they're going to be like, oh wow, what's a really good marketing stunt? Let's just send a bunch of kids to space. Maybe one of the most dangerous marketing stunts we can imagine, but still, I wouldn't put it past them to do that. So yeah, I agree with you, but I think that actually, in the end, just like brand image is going to make it so they're going to want to put citizen scientists in space. Anyone else? Ava, complication or confirmation? Anything?
I agree. I mean, I keep thinking that things have so many layers that you can continuously agree and disagree and find another loop. In general, I agree with Janet, and in particular, I would love to go to space. But definitely there are too many economic forces which are impeding the true scientific pursuit of space exploration. I'm reading now the last book from the Mars trilogy, and it seems at the same time extremely naive of what the intentions will be, but also incredibly detailed on what really could be if we didn't allow economic forces to control what is science and what isn't.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's like I think that there's a lot there, which is just kind of like or I guess, and that what's interesting for that, Eva, is I think then to kind of refine uh, um, Janet's vision. I think the hunch would have to be like we'd have to understand the time frame a little bit around it and some of the other kind of context. So I think there's some a little bit more investigation, but that's actually why the hunch hour kind of sets you down a path and says, well, what are the opening questions that we have, or the questions that are left behind. Can I throw out a hunch that I'm thinking about right now, just because I'm doing a project with a client on this, which is that I have a hunch that we're going to see theater come back in a super profound, powerful way in the coming, I'm going to say like the coming year.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I have a hunch that we're going to see theater, like live theater, like come back in a super strong and powerful way in the next year. So I'd love if anyone wants to confirm or complicate that. I'd love.
I think that's so easy to confirm. I mean, particularly around, I mean, dude, man, we're all, that's not a hunch. That's actually something that's been happening, I think, in the last 5 years, but it's only speeded up because of COVID. And everyone has had to figure out how to be more experimental, how to work with less, how to be more intuitive, how to work with digital. So I don't know, like every day we see another scenario of like fascinating theater. I just booked tickets because I'd been waiting for it to come to New York, which is the Storefront Plays.
7 cents.
Wait for that.
Today's Times. There's perfect confirmation in that.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
7 cents. It's just looks amazing.
Yeah, it's a friend of mine actually is the producer behind it. So it's like,
Oh, I should have asked you instead of buying the full price ticket.
well, I'm actually trying to get tickets from her as well. So it's actually.
I think Bushwick Star, another example, which was fascinating. And I hopefully Daniel Wilson is listening to this because he had a project about a decade ago, which not unsimilar, but there was an actor who was also a cab driver, and you had to book and you could have 3 people be in the back seat, and you would tour Bushwick through his eyes, and he would give you a tour, and that was the kind of performance where you became, participants in this storytelling tour guide. I just can't wait. I think that's where culture is moving fastest in terms of coming up with new forms, and I think we're all ready and excited to be a part of it. Some of it is like witnessing, but a lot of it is around being a participant in this work.
Yeah, well, so Karen, thank you for the kind of avid confirmation. I'm gonna avidly confirm, which is that like, it's like we're, a lot of the people I'm working with right now are theaters that are not only trying to think about like how they can do the performance, but then actually how they kind of build catalytic conversations directly after the performance. So no longer are people sort of saying it's over and you just go home and do it. They want to actually use it to kind of really profoundly shift their community. And so it's just really interesting to sort of see like that it's now kind of like it's theater, it's experimental, but it also is a tool to unlock some of the other tensions and issues that we have. So I'm like, and can anyone complicate this one? Anybody? It's like begging for somebody to.
I want to try.
Okay, sorry. Because like Karen came in pretty strong. It's like,
I know. I feel like the complication is just a throwback, which is that yes, theater is going to get really big, but also the beginning of viewable media, the beginning of interactive storytelling was theater. And if you think of like probably like post-Greek tragedy, but like thinking into modern era, thinking into Shakespeare era, it was all like extremely quotidian, day-to-day stuff that was being aired out in these pretty raucous theater halls. And I think what Karen's really pointing out is this idea that like the barrier between performative behavior and everyday life has broken down in a lot of ways. And I think that that's something that is also very like baked into where theater comes from.
It's so funny that you say that. So and I have another confirmation. Well, so wait, did you confirm it, or did you say that actually like
my complication is I guess a complication on theater's about to come back in a really big way, because I feel like it's like, yes, it's coming back in a big way, but not in a new way.
Interesting. But thanks, Peter, for joining. It was good to see you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing. What is funny is, however, how much now I'm seeing people respond to their actually, like the meeting I went to this morning, which was with the news organization, which they're like, we are theater, which is actually really funny. So it's like, I actually, honestly, one of the things I worry about is like just like how much theater might have permeated actually into the thing, or at least drama in the way that we play out. So I'd love to know if there's like one more. Is there one more hunch? And we'll do a quick round. I'll kind of talk a little bit about why that works, why hunch hour is an interesting kind of method.
I want to try and complicate your theater premise.
Go for it, Daph.
I am going to complicate it because I think that theaters have financially struggled profoundly in the last year. And so they're going to be ultra conservative in terms of their box office and how they can sustain themselves. So I think much like movie making, we're going to see sequels and things that are really tried and true, unfortunately.
Oh, so what your complication is like, we're unfortunately going to see dull theater.
Because it'll get mass audience.
Interesting.
Kill theaters.
I'd like to confirm your complication, which is the first couple of things that are coming back to Broadway are things that played out very well in 2019, 2019 and 2020. So just this notion of something that's comforting, it already, broke box office records, they bring them right back. So I think that's kind of spot on in terms of the conservatism that will be part of the theater ecosystem.
Interesting. That's like, so that's it. So what we're sort of seeing here is that there's like the confirmation of the idea that theater is going to come back. There's a question about like what's that content going to look like, and I think that so that what I would say is, Karen, thank you. Like you guys like really deeply built on the hunch, and yet actually kind of built out new nuance around stuff, which I think is really fascinating and interesting. I'm seeing people have to run, so I want to kind of do like a quick kind of kind of talk about like why we use hunch hour really quickly, if that's cool. But thank you so much, and thanks for being the first group to ever complicate the sandwich hunch, by the way. Which of course I should expect that you guys would be the ones who would do that. But I will say that one of the reasons we like the hunch hour is because of the soft language. The idea of hunch, again, is that it's not a hard test. It's not your life's work. It's not something that you think about all the time. It's something that you hold a little lightly. The confirm and complicate is not saying I agree, I disagree. It's like saying like it's soft. It holds out really well. And then I think the biggest thing here, and this is what I want to end on this because I think it's actually important, is that evidence, providing evidence for your confirmation or complication is it's countervailing to the way we convince people. So when we want to convince people of things, we most frequently will use a metaphor, or we'll use kind of like a name or something that actually feels quite simple. So again, when I was talking about political language or the language of kind of Trump, or like sorry, not Trump, of the wall, those are using metaphors to kind of cloak a conversation. When you bring evidence into a construct, even if it's kind of just something you've seen, then you actually kind of build things in an interesting way. What's also kind of funny about this is that if you ever do it like in real life, it's so much fun. It actually builds on itself. It kind of gamifies until you get like kind of greater and greater complexity and really interesting kind of like developments of your hunches. And lastly, and I don't think we've done it with you, Karen, but it's like you can do it for your business. So you can take the same methodology and take it to the institutions that you have and kind of begin to build hunches around the things you think that are going to play forward. So interestingly, Karen, the producer of the play that you just bought the expensive ticket for, that was a hunch they had. I worked with them on, I taught them hunch hour like maybe 9 months ago. This is like they were building towards this hunch then. It was like fascinating to see. So I think that it's like if you do it right, you can start to kind of use it to kind of predict the places you want to be going, and then to that end, and the reason we kind of came together tonight, build your own future, because that's the real goal here. Is like not to be a victim of someone else's future, but to build our own future as we go. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, but I also want to kind of like be respectful of time and a beautiful, really beautiful summer evening if you're in New York and in the surrounds. But if there's any other questions or thoughts, happy to go back out.
Super grateful for you joining us today, Fred, and for sharing this framework and also encouraging us to, be our own script. And
Yeah, and I just want to really specifically thank Ava for saying Bocadia, because that fixed everything for me.
Thank you so much. It was a great way to think about not discussing, but complicating things. I think I'm going to apply it to a lot of things. Thank you.
It's a bit addictive. Be careful.
the kind of addiction we need. Thank you so much, Fred. And thank you all, everybody, for joining us. Hope to see you all very soon. Go enjoy some sunshine, fresh air, and have a beautiful night.
Bye all.
Thank you, Fred.
Bye.